Welcome everybody. Sorry about my little typo on the screen here. Sometimes when it blows it up, it moves things around a little, so I apologize. I'd like to be able to house your questions, so go ahead and tap those in the chat box there if you'd like to ask any questions during the presentation. I'll keep an eye out and see if I can answer those as we go. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the defensible space, and what I feel is a really good way to think about this is we're all kind of in this thing together, and so really being responsible for ourselves at our place and our ability to get things done on the landscape is a really big deal for us in terms of what I do for my program. But for you, it's really important to look at what you do around your house. And we want to talk a little bit about how structures actually burn. And so we really know from the research that's been conducted that embers are the thing that burns homes down. Those embers are driven by wind, and they go pretty far distance away from the fire front, and depending on the vegetation type, and get in those little nooks and crannies, and we're going to talk about that stuff. But I just wanted to mention that the embers are the number one way that things burn out in the landscape. Obviously, if your house is exposed or your structure is to direct flame, that's going to cause quite an issue too. And then radiant heat as well can cause some problems, especially when we have those pretty gnarly firestorms that may come through and heavy winds. So those are the three typical ways that things burn structure-wise, but those embers are the key piece that we're going to talk about during this presentation. And there a lot of research suggests that between 60 and 90% of homes are ignited just from embers. And so really being cognizant that that's something we should consider is important. I apologize for all the relatively challenging photographs here, but we're really trying to give you a lesson learned, if you will, about the points of what's going on when embers impact the home. And so embers can get in the little nooks and crannies, as I mentioned. They can get in your vents, you can get in your gutters and other places. They can pile up along a deck, and too many embers, strength in numbers, really contributes to ignition. Here's another diagram, and this is a simulation. They built a house inside of a simulated ember tunnel, they called it, and basically had big fans blowing embers out directly onto the structure. And this is what the occurrence was of that, the end result of those research projects that they did. Here's that. You saw that kind of little, indentation in the house in that first photo, and that strength in numbers really gets going and piles up in the corners and gets this structure burning. The vents are a really important thing to consider. And if you look closely at the little picture zoomed in from the inside, you can see those embers going in through that vent. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do to mitigate some of this. But this is really important stuff to think about. We think about how we do our D-space, but the home is getting impacted by those embers. So one last one is showing the difference here between the large openings in your soffit vents and then the smaller openings. And so those 1/4 inch standard vents will let a lot more embers through versus the 1/8 inch, which blocks a significant proportion of any of those embers entering a structure if they're done properly. And you can actually buy products all ready to go when you're doing your remodel or you're building a house that are all set up and have these vents already made that are fire resilient. And so the material is important, but also the tightness of that material. So I went over all those embers and that situation there, and let's talk a little bit about how we can be more ember prepared. Well, here's a situation in this picture on the left side where the forest obviously has been impacted a little bit by the fire front, but we can see in the background that house, the structure is on fire and totally consumed and engulfed in flames, whereas the forest is, it's looking a little bit in a better place. So but most of those embers are really, I just want to emphasize, and they keep talking to us about Sadie's three times, right? The guy on the advertisement gives the 800 number 3 times. Well, I'm going to talk about embers 3 different ways here, so we just realize how important paying attention to these embers are. And having the proper materials to deal with those embers that might come your way in a wildfire situation is really important. So what are some strategies to be a little more ember prepared? Well, the first one starts at home and hardening. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit with this talk. We're not going to get super in depth, and we have other resources from other presentations we've done and other materials we've gathered. There's a whole home hardening retrofit guide out of University of Nevada that we shared on our website that's really great and provides a lot of really in-depth information. We also offered a webinar that I did recently that really kind of dialed in on some of those things. So happy to share those opportunities with you. But the other piece of that is maintaining and creating that defensible space around that structure. And we'll talk about some of the different best management practices related to that. But here in the picture on the right-hand side, you can see as part of that research project that we were looking at earlier, on one side is a standard home with cedar siding, and on the other side is a fire hardened home which has fiber cement siding and class rated roofing and vents that are proper like we saw earlier, and you can see these were the same amount of embers went towards both buildings in a very refined and confined space. And given those embers, this is what happened at the end of the day. And we're going to talk about some of the principles related to how we prevent the ignition at our structures. So where do we start with all this? Well, you got to start with understanding where you're at. What's your risk level? So conduct an assessment. It can be really simple. Boy, I need to do some work to really in depth. And there's a whole host of these things out there that can be both specifically on the home and the hardening part, and then on the D-space, defensible space aspects. And so we can go ahead and look at any of these checklists and think about, well, do I need to repair some screens? Or do I need to do some more defensible space work and have maintenance? I'm going to go into all this, but I just wanted to give you an idea. You got to start somewhere, because I'm going to throw a whole bunch of information at you, and just understanding where you're at and how to prioritize your action moving forward is really important. There are lots of ways to harden your home. So we want to start at our house and work our way out from that during this discussion today. But the home, whether you've already built it or haven't built it and you're looking at building a new structure or barn or shop or house, whatever, there are a bunch of principles that are really helpful and can guide you through the process. And there's a lot of resources related to retrofitting your current structures to be a little more ember prepared. So I'm going to spend a few more minutes kind of talking about that, and then we're going to work our way out from the house or structure from there. The roof is probably the number one thing. It's the most expensive component, but it is also the thing that takes the most impact from weather and then from fire. And so really having that roof in really good shape is important, and that should be considered as a whole system. So we showed you those eaves and soffits earlier. That's important to address too. Your gutters as well. Keep them clean. Make sure they're in good shape. Don't put plastic gutters up. Use good aluminum or metal gutters. The vents we showed you that other diagram, is really important to keep those going. The siding, you don't have to go out and reside your whole house, but making sure it's in good shape, has good paint, isn't all chipped up and have all sorts of rotten areas and different things like that. And if you are doing a remodel project, put some non-combustible siding up on there. There's a lot of really nice fiber products out there, fiber cement board and other things that are rated pretty well for fire and can do a good job to be in this situation. Our windows should be closed if there's a fire coming and we're looking at evacuating, and they should be double pane if we're replacing any of them. If we're not, that's just fine too. Just make sure they're closed and you have good screens. You can use aluminum screening on those screens to help you with any embers that might get in that screen. And decks and porches are a significant part of being exposed to embers and creating that hazardous footprint. And so there's a ton of different resources available on that. I'm not saying you have to rip your deck off or rebuild your whole deck, but there's some things you can do to help alleviate some of these issues over the long term. I showed you the roof thing. There's nothing wrong with this roof, but this is a significant issue, having the materials, the flammable vegetation material laying in the roof. So that's a pretty easy solution. After spring, you know, everything falls off all the trees when they're budding out and coming up to life for the season. Go ahead and get that blown off of there, and you've alleviated that issue. Really simple fix there. I just wanted a close up on the screens right quick here and show you the difference in the two. Very tight on that 1/8 inch mesh. So let's talk about what your place could look like if you have a carport or an open orifice to your home or your barn or your shop. Do you think this picture down in the lower corner here is what we want to have if there's a fire coming? Probably not. And when there is a fire coming, it's not the right time to clean that up. So this is pretty extreme situation, but getting ready during fire season, understanding that we are in fire season and fire season is coming, and being ready for that would be a really good way to alleviate that, keep that stuff cleaned up. And just in general, having good practices where our pesticides and chemicals are in a good place, stored properly. I'm sure most of you have that situation already under, in a good place, but let's just think about what's out there and what am I doing and how am I being prepared. A lot of people, and I've been guilty of this as well, have a garage door that's a little loose, or the molding on that door isn't real tight. Pretty easy fix. Sometimes just adjusting the track a little bit, or maybe replacing that piece of molding right along the edge there, and then making sure that garage door shuts all the way down, and maybe just replacing the weather stripping on the bottom, or a quick adjustment in the track to get that thing all the way down so embers can't make their way inside the garage would be a really good way to look at. And then a lot of this happens over time where we get a little bit of moisture splashing up from rain or snow events, and it starts to kind of degrade the paint. It might not rot that door frame just yet, but we've created a place where embers can accumulate and potentially ignite the structure. So that's what's up in this upper right-hand corner of this photo here. And so just taking that, getting a quick scrape on some of that, putting a fresh coat of paint on it before fire season starts. That's a really easy way to both maintain the integrity of your door so it lasts a little longer, and then two, be ready for any sort of fire issue you may have. So we're going to kind of move away from the house now. And I want to talk a little bit about this idea behind active and passive defense. The active is things where, if a firefighter will be there, we can create that space so they can do something. Whereas what I suggest is some of the things that we're recommending here is what's the plan so we reduce that exposure ahead of time without intervention from the fire department or from emergency responders. And we have a really good opportunity to do this stuff ahead of time. It's the little things that pile up over time that will lead to an issue if there were a fire and embers coming your way to potentially ignite that house. So getting ahead of this stuff, and a ton of research has been done on these specific topics to help us give you some of the best management practices and our recommendations to be a little bit more prepared. So the 3 ignition zones we're going to talk about are the immediate, right close to the house, the intermediate, just a little further away, and we say we should keep it lean, clean, and green there. If I say that 3 times fast, I'll probably mess it up, so I'm just going to give it to you once. And additionally, the extended zone, so that further out part, and what are we doing there? And so these are the kind of different areas we're going to focus on. I'm going to go through each one of these just one at a time. We're going to talk about how we could do some of this stuff. So the immediate zone, that's the 0 to 5. So basically right against your foundation and out 5 feet. We want to create an ember resistant zone right there. So not using bark mulch, not allowing leaves and other grasses and other things to accumulate that are dead up against the home that can easily combust. Keep that stuff cleared out, create a non-combustible area. You can make it look really nice. We don't have to create a moonscape out there. This is a paver patio project where we did all that, got everything away, put a bunch of rock and paver, so hardscape that. And on the right-hand side of that photo is a shop that has the same kind of thing all the way around it. Anything that will not combust is a perfect thing to have in this 0 to 5 foot area. It's just a recommendation that we think is something that has been proven by research to work really well. So again, in that immediate zone, we want to talk about removing any fuels around your structures that can burn. In this picture up on the upper right-hand side here, you can see they transition from a standard slat wood fence to a non-combustible fencing material for the last few feet going up towards the house. That's a really cool way to look at how do we, just retrofit some of the stuff that we already have on our property to be a little bit more prepared for a fire. We typically stack wood in the wintertime to be prepared for cold weather. Well, in the summertime, we should move that wood back out to the storage shed, which is located at least 30 feet from your structures, and make sure we pull our gas cans out of there and what are other things we've used during the wintertime to make that space somewhere where embers cannot go. And then I just wanted to point out underneath this deck here, now it doesn't have a screening on it, but a good easy thing to do early on would be to get the leaf blower and clean all those leaves out from the year before in the springtime, and then consider installing some sort of a screening to block that stuff from getting in there. And then just maintaining that during the summertime would be a really easy way to kind of keep up with that part of it. All right, so the next zone out is that intermediate, and that's about 5 to 30 feet or so. And we say, as I mentioned earlier, to keep it lean, clean, and green. We can space out our trees a little bit. We can have nice green lawns in there that are irrigated. You can have flowers and shrubs and things. Again, irrigated, green, get rid of all the dirt, decadent and dead materials out of there every spring. Keep those shrubs kind of confined down a little bit. Space our trees, lift them. Ladder fuels that Katie mentioned earlier are important to reduce by pruning. There's some tons of suggestions on different spacings and things, but I want to think about just making sure that things aren't touching one another and getting them spaced out a little bit. And you can have some clumps of plants and materials, that's just fine, but make sure that there's some good space in between them. Here's an example around the house where they got their 0 to 5 as a gravel yard around, and then they got a green lawn area around that. And this is a really good situation here. So then let's go out to the next zone, and that's called the extended zone, and that's from 30 to 100 foot minimum. So go out as far as you can is kind of what we're looking at there. We're going to reduce our fuels, cut the grass back. In this picture on the lower left-hand side, this was a house I owned in Central Oregon for a little bit, and we cut out a ton of juniper and removed a lot of sage and all the other shrubs out there, and then went through and cut back all the cheatgrass that was occupying that area to try and reduce that seed source, as Katie mentioned, and then we're doing some herbicide treatments on that as well. And we really wanted to just thin that stuff out, prune it back, separate it, reduce the continuity of that fuel that Katie mentioned earlier so that the fire can't just run across that. And you can see here, there's a really good, additional buffer on the road, the access road. So we've really widened that area out by mowing. Has really made a big difference, and will knock those flame lengths down and create something that we can defend there. So why is it important to understand where you're at and how do we prioritize our treatments? Well, the topography and slope really do affect the behavior of fires. So if the slope, for example, on this picture on the right-hand side, and your house is right at the top of that, and you have all those trees that potentially get a spark in them, those embers will go right up the slope, and we're preheating those fuels in front of that fire is going to get going pretty quick. So think about what that needs to look like when we're looking at how far out we should treat from a structure. And then, we know that on the south side, the fuels are dried out a little quicker during the summertime. In the north, we get heavier fuels, but they do stay typically in a higher moisture level for a longer part of the day. And so kind of knowing where you're at and where the fire might come, so understanding where the prevailing winds are and all that, y'all know all these things, and just putting it in a context of fire and helping me understand where should I focus my treatments as I'm moving through some of these different principles we're trying to present to you today. So here's some more just examples of how to create that fuel break. And again, this doesn't have to be a moonscape out there, but we do want to thin things out. We want to separate stuff. We want to create good distance between all the trees and the canopies. If it's steep slopes, we should space things out more because that fire, again, is going to preheat that fuel ahead of it and move up that slope quicker. And so we want to maintain that safety. So we have a bigger fuel break on the bottom side of the road and a smaller fuel break on the top side of that road, for example, in this situation. In addition, how far do we go out? Well, that's really up to you and your situation, or maybe your landowner boundaries, but could also be a good opportunity to talk to your neighbor. Hey, my driveway is real close to the property boundary. Would you be willing to work with me? I'd like to create a little bit more spacing to keep, to keep things separated a little bit better. So let's consider the emergency responder access. Well, we know that firefighters are brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and children for that matter. And so their safety is the priority here above everything. And know that, the people who manage firefighters have that same mentality and are not going to put firefighters in a bad spot. But we can do a lot of good stuff to ensure that they stay safe and are in a good place by making sure we have good signage on our streets and our neighborhoods, and making sure our addresses are signed properly and have good driveway clearance for visibility. Provide that wide space in the driveway, open things up a little bit. If you got a tractor or a dump truck or a water truck or a bigger vehicle and it can't get in and out of your driveway without an issue, well, a fire truck isn't going to be able to either, and they're going to keep on driving. So open stuff up and know that they're tall as well. There's a height requirement there as well. And then I always just mention this, and y'all probably know this. Don't wait for anybody to reach out and say, you have to, go now. If you won't feel comfortable, get out of the way and make sure that you're ready to go. Don't wait for that evacuation notice, because this bottom picture on the right-hand side here is not a situation you want to be in, if at all possible. Things happen, we understand that, but let's do the best we can to make sure we're not in danger and someone else isn't in danger either. I think it's really important to consider all the pieces of infrastructure across your property, your pump houses, where you're storing your equipment, where your materials are stored. Metal buildings, they're great for a lot of reasons, but they can also be really good places for embers to get in nooks and crannies. So doing the maintenance, making sure all that investment in that building that we put together is going to help be resilient against a fire. The doors are closed, the seals are proper, the roof's in good shape, the vents are closed up pretty good, all those kind of things. And then all the different buildings, fences, everything that occurs on your property, whatever your crop production system is or whatever you're farming, make sure you're considering all those different pieces. If there's a way that we can do a little bit of work to salvage something in the case of a fire, let's do that. One comment I like to make too is making sure we have proper signage on things so that the emergency services personnel know what they're getting into. If they just ran to this shed and didn't know what was in there in terms of pesticides or materials that could potentially be caustic to them, that wouldn't be awesome. And so just put a sign up somewhere, or invite your local fire department over and say, hey, this is where we do this and this is where we do that. They're happy to have that information ahead of time so that they can help provide a safe opportunity to get engaged with that fire. So before the season begins, which is now, go ahead and start getting a hold of those checklists. There's a ton of different ways to do it. We have lots of tips on our website, and we can punch that up for you. But there's no wrong or right way. Your local community might have some of these as well, but please do something. And that's the biggest thing, is taking some action. If you're just getting started with this and haven't really done it in the past, do one thing. Maybe it's just assess. Maybe it's just looking at what's out there on the landscape, or maybe it's actually conducting an assessment on your place, or bringing out the local fire department who may offer that service, or maybe just having a conversation with them and they can point some things out that would be stuff that they'd be real engaged with. If you're further along and have been doing a lot of this stuff, review those checklists, keep up, do your maintenance, get to that one project that you've kind of had hanging out there that you're like, yeah, I need to do that. It's time now. And as Katie mentioned earlier, that fire doesn't stop at the property line. It doesn't care where your boundary is versus your neighbors. So I know that was a lot of information in a really short period of time, but that's pretty much what I have for now. That's about all the time I have. So again, we have a ton of resources available on the web and our different events and activities that we're doing out there, and your local departments do as well. I'm not sure if we have any time for questions, but that's what I have. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, John. I'll just say there was a question in the chat, which Rick did a good job of concisely answering, but I just want to read it out loud and have you answer it for everyone else to hear too. So the question is, what is the difference between the 5 to 30 foot and 30 to 100 foot defensible space?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think about having less, the closer you get to your house, have less material that could potentially ignite and potentially put embers toward your structure. That's kind of what I think about. So I want it to be really thin and have fewer plants and fewer materials and keep it green. We can potentially irrigate in some of these places, or if we don't irrigate, we can make sure that we cut that vegetation down to less than 4 inches during the fire season when that stuff is cured for the year. And so that's kind of what I would look at for that stuff. The further out we get, the less intensive we may have to manage that. But again, we talked about the slope aspect. So think about where could that fire come from historically, and how we could reinforce and give ourselves a bigger buffer. We're just trying to increase the chance that we can get through an opportunity if a fire were to be on our ground. So that's what I would really focus on, is making sure that we have as much space, the biggest buffer we can afford in a given situation. And again, it's going to look different all across your property.
Yeah, and I would add too, in my mind, the big difference too is, if you really want to get strict about defensible space in your property, you probably don't want tree branches touching your buildings or your structure. So often it's like, you want trees preferably, at least 10 feet away. So I know that kind of gets in between those two zones. But, really in my mind, you really don't want trees that close to structure. Could you have trees within 30 feet if the branches aren't touching the structure? Potentially. But, it's going to depend a lot on your situation, like John is saying there. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking out, we're not going to have to cut everything down there. And I understand what we're looking at, but we also want to do the best we can. And so maybe there's a historic tree that's 30 feet away. Okay, we're not going to cut that thing down. That's fine. But let's clean it up. Let's bring in the arborist maybe and get it trimmed up. Make sure we have good green around it, and then space everything else around that tree. So that's just an example. These are rules of thumb and some different recommendations. There is no right or wrong way to do this stuff, but anything you can do is better than nothing.